Acute tensions in the global trading system were evident well before the onset of COVID-19, manifesting in the intentions in the institutions set up to regulate global trade and to adjudicate disputes. All this underpinned by apparently serious and growing geopolitical tensions between a hitherto hegemonic United States and a rising Republic of China. Is the global trading system now at an inflection point? What are the risks and implications for countries in the global south? And are there opportunities to strive for more equitable outcomes? As former Minister Rob Davies suggested in an MI seminar some months ago. These are just some of the issues that our expert interlocutors this evening will help us think about more carefully. So now it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Claire Gamage. I hope my pronunciation is correct, but Claire will have the opportunity to correct me shortly, if that's necessary. Claire is a teacher at Bristol University in the United Kingdom, has published extensively in the fields of international law and development, and is an expert on international trade agreements with a particular focus on the global south. Dr. Francisca Zucker, I think I've got that pronunciation right because I was corrected. Francisca corrected me the last time, is an associate professor in the Wits School of Law. So she's a colleague. Like Dr. Gamage, is also a teacher of international trade and public international law. Is an expert, well, her expert includes trade agreements, digital trade, African regional integration, and competition. So it's now my great pleasure to welcome them, to welcome all of the participants. In no particular order, Francisca and Dr. Gamage, whom of you wants to go first?
Thanks, Firoz, for the kind invitation. Claire will go first, but I just wanted to say before, thank you all for joining and your interest, and that we didn't decide that format to be like Claire has half an hour and me. We wanted to do that a bit more conversational. We are not sure whether that will work out, but we are very happy to try. So we jump between the two of us at all times. Thank you.
Yes, that would be great.
Yeah, that's at least how we try it. On my side, there was already a lot of times a bad network quality. So I hope it will be stable.
We all hope it will be stable, Francisca. Okay.
Thanks. Okay, I would hand over to Claire first now. A wonderful colleague of mine from Bristol, and I love to work with her.
Thank you very much indeed, Firoz, for the very kind and generous introduction and for welcoming me to come and do this with the Mandela Institute and with Francesca, who's a very dear friend of mine and a very good colleague indeed. So thank you to everyone who is here and present. It really is an honor and a privilege to be able to join you all. I think that one of the few, in my opinion, one of the very few benefits of the pandemic has been that I've been able to connect with people in a very different way than we traditionally would in academia. So I'm getting to meet lots of people around the world, which is great. So today we're actually going to talk to you, as indicated in that lovely introduction there, about trade and vulnerabilities in the multilateral trading system. And Fran, I'm not sure, are you going to be sharing screen at some point?
I do already.
Do that? Ah, okay, I can't see that. So I do apologize. Are your videos on? I can't see anything apart from a blank screen.
Maybe somebody else can say. Can you see it?
No.
Okay, then I'll try again, Claire. It's fine.
Okay, I'll keep talking as we do that. The joys of technology. Now? Nope, nothing.
Okay, damn it.
That's okay, I'll keep talking. I'm sure something will pop up eventually.
Okay,
so what we're hoping to do today, as you can see, it already is extremely conversational, is we're going to talk to you about something we're working on, both together and also as part of a larger group, around how we can place vulnerabilities at the center of analysis in international economic law, and Fran and I in our particular discipline in trade. Now, as Firoz has mentioned, the multilateral trading system has been in crisis for some time, so the pandemic certainly hasn't revealed anything new to those of us who work within this system. Something that we hope to explore with you today as we go through is to think about the ways in which the pandemic may in fact offer some opportunities to resolve some of those crises that were existing before the pandemic, but also to show how the multilateral system is broken and that it can in fact both sustain and create new forms of vulnerabilities, sustain and reproduce existing structural patterns of inequalities and dependencies within the system. And what we mean by that is the ways in which countries may be particularly dependent, for example, on an export, and how that then can affect and trickle down into society and affect individuals as workers, for example. So what Fran and I are interested in looking at is both the macro and how that trickles down then to the domestic level and policy, and how that frames our everyday existence and our lives. So to that end, we're interested in looking at how trade rules interact with and inform our daily lives. But we both write on issue linkages, so the ways in which trade intersects with, say, for example, gender or sustainable development or culture. So we will touch on some of these themes in our lecture today. We already know that there's lots of different initiatives taking place domestically across the African continent, and we'll touch on some of these as we go through. But what we are really hoping to drum home through this lecture today is this sort of three phases of crisis, almost pre-COVID, during COVID, and how do we then respond to those crises in a post-COVID environment. So as I said, it's building on existing work that we're doing. We do actually have a special issue that will be forthcoming in the African Journal of International Economic Law that is being convened by myself, Professor Bizi Akinkugwe and Professor James Gathi. So we're very much excited about that, and that will come out early next year. So we'll move on.
Claire, can you see that?
I can't see anything. I just see lots of boxes of people's names. Okay. So someone has helpfully said only the host of the meeting can do that. So we might have to ask Magda.
Yeah, I think I cannot because I'm not the host. I forgot that. Magda, can I?
Maybe fairly to Magda.
Yes, I will. Yeah, okay. I will.
Certainly.
Thank you, Magda. And thank you all for being so patient and understanding as we navigate these technical hitches. So. As we wait for our image to go on the screen, as I say, the purpose of our lecture here is to explore the many ways in which the trading system can promote resilience, but also the many ways in which it can exacerbate and sustain pre-existing inequalities and create new vulnerabilities. We've seen over the past 15 years how trade liberalization has contributed to the rapid economic growth of certain countries and the gap between developed and developing countries narrowing in some instances, but certainly not all instances. And something that I'll touch upon later is around special and differential treatment and the system within the WTO that should have enabled developing countries to integrate into the system more effectively. When we look at the WTO's most recent reports, we see in 2018 that it's reiterated the role of trade as an enabler and an engine for sustainable growth and global poverty reduction. But what's become really apparent in the most recent months, even here in the United Kingdom, believe it or not, it turns out we are not resilient to many things, that the effects of the pandemic are aggravating existing vulnerabilities. We have indeed seen that there's an overwhelming sense that the effects of the pandemic will sustain and deepen those inequalities and threaten the progress that's been made towards poverty eradication around the world, and especially through proposals to reform various aspects of trade, investment, finance through sustainable development goals and the policies thereunder. I want you to bear in mind as we discuss trade before and during and after COVID, that one of the overarching goals of the World Trade Organization that's set out in the Marrakesh Declaration of 1994 is to create a fairer and more open trading system. And that actually means creating a more equal playing field for inclusive growth for all countries. That was set out in 1994. The Sustainable Development Goals also reiterate that point and say that we want the WTO to be creating a fair, rules-based and equitable system, and that doing so is fundamental to sustainable and inclusive growth. So what we want to do today is to problematize these issues and to think about how, as existing and new vulnerable subjects emerge in the international community, what type of innovative responses we can identify that might promote equalities and freedoms and to help those countries integrate better into the global system. In order to do that, both Fran and I in our work, argue that we need to articulate coherent and effective responses to the significant effects of the pandemic. And we also need to see the interconnections between vulnerable subjects. And that means not just states as vulnerable subjects or countries as vulnerable subjects within the state-centric system of international economic law and the multilateral trading system, but also about how we find innovative responses to support individuals within those vulnerable states. So individuals themselves are vulnerable subjects. So I'm going to pass over to Fran now, who's going to talk about trade in the era of COVID.
Yes, thank you. It's still not there, but that doesn't matter. What we want to, before we actually can identify the impacts that the pandemic, when you call it like this, has, we wanted to start with just lining out the responses from governments, the trade responses, because they actually lead to the impact and not the pandemic as such. So how did states respond to COVID-19? And the first very known worldwide lockdown measures and physical distance measures due to, all over the world, just to react to it. From a trade perspective, even more important is all the export restrictions and prohibitions that were adopted due to, let me say, fear of shortage. And this we saw primarily in the area of food and medical services. I think the terminology here is PPE. I have never heard that terminology before COVID appeared, but now it's in all my vocabularies because nobody speaks about something else anymore than PPEs. But this is export restrictions, and at the same time also import facilitation measures in specific sectors, actually in the very same, to facilitate exactly those areas where there is a shortage to come into the country. Another thing we observe is massive support to domestic industries from governments, and that includes restrictions of import, competition, and trade distorting subsidies, all that sort of thing. It's a very protective, protectionist agenda that is to be observed there. It goes further with restrictions on foreign direct investments and culminates in the advocacy for self-sufficiency. And that is an interesting point. It goes to reshoring of manufacturing and even decoupling from the current global value chains. And it's interesting because arguably no country in the world is actually able to do so. Not even the most developed, economically developed countries. But nevertheless, you hear those calls, advocacy for those independencies from everything around them. So these are the trade responses, also attempts to enhance the IT infrastructure because of the move towards digital services to cope with that. You have seen they're very innovative things like Kenya, for example, who set up these balloons to increase the coverage in rural areas with wireless connections and sometimes up to 4 gig. So these responses we have, then we collected a couple of stats which would have been nicer to see, to just give you an idea of what those responses had for an impact globally. And very roughly, I mean, we all saw this in the news. You get these reports, and it's very dramatic, always pictured. But just very general, the global economy, one says it's already declined by 3%, which doesn't sound that bad. But international trade between 13% and 33% already, and we would know that developing countries are in the higher areas of loss. And global growth in total is projected as 6.5%, I read here from the IMF, lower than still anticipated in January this year, and obviously disproportionately affect those low-income countries. If one gets even more specific with regards to employment, and that is, of course, also for South Africa of high importance, is that the ILO already estimate that a loss of 400 million full-time jobs, at first just full-time jobs, and 14% reduction in global working hours. And even more so when you look at the informal economy, where 2 billion people working in, which accounts for 62% of people participating in the global labor force, is anticipated to decline by 82%. So this is very high. Just yesterday, we received the new stats for South Africa for the second quarter, and I had the tables actually in that presentation. In the second quarter, and we know that this was the time of our beginning of the lockdown, the GDP of South Africa declined by 51%. This is split into sectors, what was published yesterday. There's one sector that actually increased, and every other sector decreased, and really dramatically. The one sector that increased was agriculture. That can probably be explained by that food supplies continued and had to be locally distributed. I don't know, I'm not an economist, so, but the stats show exactly that. So the reasons for those bad stats and for those impacts globally, we think we can find, and when we narrow it a bit down, where the disruptions have taken place and what type of vulnerabilities have been revealed or deepened because they were actually already there. I'm handing over to you again.
Thanks, Fran. Yeah, so as Fran has just said, oh, sorry, just a chat popping up there as well.
Yeah.
As Fran has just said, the real significant stat I find is one from the World Bank, actually, that says that COVID-19 will push between 70 to 100 million people across the world into extreme poverty. And extreme poverty means that you're living on less than $1.90 per day. It's actually a distorted picture, though, because it doesn't really take into account those who are still living in poverty, but will be pushed into worse poverty, but not quite extreme poverty because of the pandemic. So one thing we need to bear in mind, and I think that everyone feels, irrespective of where we are geographically located, is that the pandemic is having very real effects on our well-being and on our standard of living.
But Claire, If I just may interact there, just to say that in that same report, it was said that India and Sub-Saharan Africa have the most effects with regards to that poverty. That might be also important. Yeah.
Yes, and what we're going to see as we go through this lecture, as Fran has just pointed out, we've tried to focus it as much as we can on Africa, but actually that wasn't particularly difficult to do because the reports all point to Sub-Saharan Africa being one of the most hard hit regions in the world by the pandemic. So what we're seeing is commonalities to a degree, but I'm saying that in a very light touch way because I am not saying that in the UK the problems we are experiencing can be compared at all to the issues that are being experienced in some African countries right now. But what we are all seeing is a disruption of supply and demand chains. We're seeing in terms of agriculture, for example, different consumption patterns, people turning to different types of commodities and products. And I'll talk about agriculture a little bit later, but we're seeing changes and shifts in consumption patterns. We're seeing shifts in supply and demand. We're seeing disruptions across global value chains. And this is really problematic because at the moment, the World Bank and the WTO estimate that approximately 2/3 of global trade is now conducted through global value chains. If there is a disruption within the chain, be that from the production base through to the lead firm, that creates a delay in getting that product or commodity or service or whatever it is that you're trying to get out of the chain. It causes a delay in getting that out, which then has an impact on the consumer. And so the pandemic has shown us the importance of having seamless and resilient global value chains. It's also worth bearing in mind, just to go back to Fran's point a moment ago about, a lot of the data being linked to Africa. Where African countries are participating in global value chains, it's really important to bear in mind their position within those global value chains. And more often than not always, but more often than not, we are dealing with workers working at the low value added end of the chain, which means they're already in a precarious position. They will be working predominantly in the informal economy, and they are subject to any sort of change in export price will then affect their wages, and it could affect their labour position. So we have to bear in mind that a disruption to the chain can have very real impacts on people and labour. We're seeing unreasonably high price increases on commodities globally, and that's then also having an effect again on consumption, particularly in agriculture and agricultural produce, but certainly not exclusively in that area. We are seeing an increase, if you keep track of the WTO, very helpfully has started an export restriction database where it's providing an e-ping alert every day to tell you the newest export restrictions that have been put in place. What we're seeing is a higher level of notification around product safety and what we would call the SPS issues, sanitary and phytosanitary issues. One thing that, this webinar has actually shown me, in the UK, it's very rare that we have an internet problem. We're very fortunate to have high bandwidth speeds and good fibre optics and all the rest of it. And Fran will tell you, in the many conversations I have with her, I am often dealing with what she terms and what you'll term a load shedding or shedding. Load shedding. Yes, so I don't even know what that is. So it's also enabling us to better understand the conditions in which we're all working, but it's also a really important point around connectivity, and being able to innovate will require digital capacity that simply is not there around the world yet. And Fran's going to talk about digital and tech in a moment, but it's really important that we bear in mind when we're talking about vulnerabilities that we put an emphasis on the fact that some of us are more equal than others. Some of us are already working in a very different environment to others. And this is where the stagnation of development is likely to be deepened by the shift now to innovation and technology to overcome some of the challenges to the pandemic. And I'll talk to some innovations within Africa that I think are really interesting when I come to the agricultural context to show how digital can work and is working. What we're also seeing is a decline in export earnings with tourism and primary commodities. So government revenue is lower than expected. For governments that are heavily reliant on that revenue, that then trickles down to having an effect on public expenditure on social and public health, for example. Now, when you're dealing with least developed countries and developing countries, the expenditure on public health is already going to be minimal. You know, in Liberia, they only have 3 ventilators in the whole country for everyone to deal with. If they have a COVID outbreak, they are severely disadvantaged. That's their starting point. And so we do need to think about the ways in which all of these pieces of the puzzle have to connect if we're to build resilience within our communities. What we also know is that the pandemic is not gender blind. There are gender dimensions to the pandemic, and there are gender dimensions to trade. A lot of my most recent work deals with trade and gender and the disproportionate effect, the disproportionate impact that shifts in trade rules can have for women, but also for other marginalized communities like Indigenous groups and also people, persons with disabilities. And I hate that word disability, but it is the word that we have to use for the time being. So what we see is, particularly, for example, earlier I mentioned the global value chain. We know that women are disproportionately represented in global value chains at the lower value added end. So say, for example, if you look at Bangladesh, women have always assumed a very high proportion of the labor force in the global value chain in textiles. And so there have been initiatives funded predominantly through overseas development assistance from various countries to support women to get training so that they can skill up, and to support them in getting safe housing and getting secure employment in the formal economy. Now, what the pandemic is doing, and I can say this myself, is we are now having to juggle a higher level of reproductive labour, which is our unpaid work, so childcare, domestic work, caring responsibilities, alongside working responsibilities. And so the pandemic is having both real economic impacts, but lots of social impacts that then link into the economic. We're going to talk to you about 2 specific examples in agriculture and in digital, because we felt that those were 2 that were really nice to sort of link into the African context in particular. So Fran, I don't know if you want to add anything at this point before I jump into agriculture.
You can. I think it's perfect to just at first give the agriculture point, because it is mainly Africa, but it also affects others.
Absolutely.
It's actually quite nice, yeah.
And you know, you're absolutely right. We're seeing even in the EU, you know, with our very generous agricultural subsidy system, even our own so-called robust system of agriculture is struggling. In the UK, we are no longer part of the EU. And with Brexit ever closer at the end of December, you know, our farmers have been very concerned about the way in which the pandemic has disrupted their global value chains and their supply chains. What has been common to all countries, it seems, is that the disruption caused by lockdowns, by export restrictions, by the decrease in travel, so the lack of cargo export, getting your cargo onto a plane to get it to wherever it should be going, has meant that food supplies have been diverted back towards the local community. So it's been domestic redistribution. And we're seeing that even up here in a global north state. COVID-19 is therefore showing us these important interconnections between agricultural production and climate, conflict, natural disasters, pests, and labour. Surprisingly, so far, I think, and whilst there are examples that I will speak to that go against what I'm about to say, overall agriculture has shown resilience during the pandemic. I mentioned earlier that there has been a change in consumption patterns that has affected trade flows. But actually the initial response to COVID-19 was framed around ensuring availability of food supplies. So the first phase, when the pandemic really took hold and countries went into lockdown, was to minimize disruptive effects, maintain food availability, and also maintain food safety standards. We saw an increase in export restrictions, new SPS measures on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, but we also saw some tariff reductions and an increase in stockpiling so that local communities could be well catered for, so to speak, if the crisis were to continue to deepen. In agriculture, we also saw a decline in the export of fresh produce and meat. Now, that demand is actually in part driven by restaurants, and I'm sure, you know, we are certainly not alone in the UK of having seen our restaurant and catering industry heavily affected by the pandemic. So we saw a decline in fresh produce and meat, but we saw an increase in the export of staple foods, processed fruits and vegetables. Staple produce like maize, wheat and rice are in very high demand at the moment. And in South Africa, for example, this bodes well because the maize production of 2020 was expected to be 30% higher than it had been, and it was meant to be its highest crop yield in 3 years because of a changing climate. So some countries are going to be able to benefit from this if they can export it, if they can actually get it outside of their state, provided there is transport available. But we do know that transport times have been extended, they've been disrupted by COVID, and obviously there have been labour shortages as people cope with trying to recover from being ill or having a lockdown and not being able to work. One way that they have actually responded to this in most countries is to designate agricultural services and anything to do with the agricultural production line as an essential service, which has meant that that can keep going through the pandemic. But agriculture and food security go hand in hand. And we know that from SDG 2, which is around agricultural production and food security and protecting communities from becoming food insecure. Food security is all about having access to appropriate food. And what we mean by that is, you know, that you would give food that is culturally appropriate, not just having the availability of food. It must be appropriate to that particular cultural context as well. And we know from the recent report of the Food and Agricultural Organization and the World Food Programme that the countries at most risk of food security deterioration as a result of COVID-19 are developing countries. And the visual that we actually had for you from the infographic from that report actually demonstrates how those countries that are most at risk of food insecurity are in sub-Saharan Africa. So we have a real point, almost like being on the precipice of something very, very devastating if we do not find ways to build resilience within the system in sub-Saharan Africa. Africa's GDP, its gross domestic product, in terms of agriculture accounts for 23%. Approximately 60% of sub-Saharan African population is working in agriculture. Although we have to be sensitive to the context there, the majority is small holding and informal labour. But the agricultural market is really, really significant. It's worth between 35 billion and 40 billion a year in terms of exports. So as you can see, that value there, if there are disruptions in the chain that cause a decline in that revenue, that could have a very real and serious economic impact on African states. And that will also then have a real significant economic and social impact within those states. There is a heavy dependency on certain regions. And as we mentioned at the very beginning of this lecture, that vulnerabilities are linked to dependencies. And about 80% of agricultural export from Africa are designated to Western Europe, where about 45% of products go. About 20% go to South and East Asia. 10% go to the Middle East and 5% go to North America. Now, I'm sure it will come as no surprise that your highest dependency is on the Western Europe markets, the EU, because that's how trade has been structured to create patterns of dependency. And that's where the pandemic has really revealed and illustrated those patterns of dependency, because we've got various trade agreements in place that actually secure that dependency and lock it in law. We have some examples where there are countries at more risk than others. So for example, we are more concerned about Côte d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya and Tanzania and Uganda, which are heavily dependent on exports earnings. In East Africa, there's been locust infestation since 2019, which has affected crops and harvest. There's been flooding and conflict in South Sudan, northern Nigeria, and the Sahel, which has then affected communities and brought them to the brink of food insecurity. While certain products like cocoa are already at low prices before the pandemic, there's now a sign actually that those prices are going to increase, which is good. One of the most worst affected sectors actually is the flour sector in Kenya, which has been very badly affected by lockdowns, and in part because of the suspension of international passenger flights, which reduces the cargo export availability to 75% less than what it was before. So that's caused a hike in the price of exporting the goods, because the commodity, sorry, because there is less available cargo space and it's harder to fulfill orders. Meanwhile, commodities, as I say, like cocoa, exported vegetables, nuts and coffee have been resilient, which shows that they're less vulnerable to disruptions. In terms of responses, and before I then hand over to Fran, what I would say is there are already good initiatives across Africa that are helping to build in some resilience to this, and there are some technological innovations. So, for example, there are various apps in Ghana. In Ghana, agriculture accounts for a major sector, but 95% of that sector is cultivated land that's occupied by small and medium-sized farms. So digital platforms there like Azoku and Farmerline and Trotro Tractor are really important apps and digital platforms that help to keep farmers connected to respond to disruptions much more quickly. And I can speak to that a little bit later, but for now I'll hand over to Fran to talk about how the digital divide in Africa is also a vulnerability hotspot.
Yes, it is a hotspot, and I'm not tired of pointing it out. Jonathan, you might be tired now because you have heard it in Morris as well, but it is important because as we had the lockdown and the physical, I keep on saying physical distancing measures, in order to continue with business, we know that almost everything went to, what was possible at least, went to digital. And digital services, therefore, were in high demand. And we know that as online shopping, thanks, Jonathan. We tried online shopping, internet telephony. We are doing at the moment what one calls telephone conferencing. We're streaming, using all the streaming services more. Internet and data service generally have in high demand. So we know that, and that was also to cope with the new situation and to carry on with economic activities, right? So this acceleration of using digital services reveals now vulnerabilities and the digital divide, which is a buzzword sometimes, but it is actually a reality. And it reveals that both within Africa itself, but also between Africa and the world. And a lot of countries in the world were able to adapt to that quite easily and quickly. The infrastructure is in place, and of course they also had to enhance and do something with bandwidth and so on. But very little. Why and how does this digital divide show, and why is it so important? Important to understand it is for the regulation of digital trade, which we come then to. But how does it show? Well, first and foremost, it is the access to internet as such. And when I did my research, I have different types of stats. I use now 26%, meaning 26% in Africa have only access to internet. And this is the most positive stat I found. It goes to others like only 12% over the African continent and so on. But I like to think positive, and that would be 26% in all Africa. And we also know, because we are sitting here at the moment in Joburg, at least many of us, Claire not, and some others also not, that we are almost covered in Joburg. Yeah, so that also shows you that it is between the countries completely different, and between the regions. So you have countries like Eritrea with 1.3% coverage. And generally, by the way, only 1 in 5 people in LDC countries use the internet. And then we have Morocco and Tunisia and South Africa, who are in the mid-50s of coverage of internet. But nevertheless, please let us say that mid-50s. That means also South Africa cannot really stop working on getting that sorted. In many countries, there's not even stats available about this. So why is that so? Why is that so? And it has three main reasons, and it's costs, infrastructure, skills. That's how one can say it. And with regards to the costs, I could just refer to similar reports. The costs are way above average from the world prices. And here you have studies made. They use different types of contracts. You know, when you have contracts for a month, and then you what you pay for a decent amount of speed and so on. And the costs go from $2,666 in Africa for a month package, with others, Mauritania, Burundi, Equatorial Guinea, and $600 or $300 per month. And merely hearing these numbers, we understand that the people there are not really able to afford those prices, and that leads to not having access. Infrastructure is a very big point. There is sometimes no network in rural areas very often. I made the example earlier that Kenya put up the balloons to cover, to enhance the coverage of to 4 gig, but also broadband speed. And broadband speed is also the slowest in Africa. When you look at the stats, look at us, we're looking at numbers here, we're looking at letters. Claire made a joke earlier about it, but for us it's normal when we have meetings here that we're not switching the video on. And if I switch now the video on and I do it for a second, what happens is that on top, and it starts now, it says already bad network quality. That's what it says. So what do? I switch it back off. So that's what we're doing. In other parts of the world, that's not the case. In webinars where I was, where the only one from the African continent, I was the only one who had to switch it off. So this is a big problem. So infrastructure, reliable internet, electricity to actually be able to participate. I'm glad I could teach you the word load shedding, which we all struggle badly at the moment. Although no, they have actually cancelled it for today, so that's fine. So now that is the internet access problem. We have other problems with difficulty of access to online payment solutions, a low visibility in online searches, advertising and sales platform for small businesses. When you look at the algorithms in search platforms, we have high tariffs on telecommunication services, and they are still between 30 and 40. We have difficulties in consumer trust. So these reasons are all reasons why this divide is so big and has deepened with the move to the digital services. And nevertheless, we should highlight that in Africa, there is a huge trend from digital platforms. So there is a huge increase and a huge activity. And Claire mentioned a couple of solutions, and there are many, many places where you can actually see that a lot of things happened. But these places are mainly in Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, and Egypt, to mention as well. So you have these hotspots in Africa where things are a bit better. But general, that highlights the divide. And it highlights something else. Because in the multilateral trade negotiations, when we were pushed, I'm saying we as South Africa or African countries, to engage in negotiations about, they call it still sometimes e-commerce, but let's say the right term, digital trade. Yeah, the argument usually is made that developing countries will simply benefit from it. But if you're not ready for it, and if you don't have the infrastructure, then who is going to benefit from that? So it's difficult, and without the considerations of what exactly is problematic, understanding the digital divide and understanding where the readiness is problematic, we cannot actually create digital trade rules, which I come later to, because that's on the African agenda very soon. But Claire will explain now this. These are just highlighted 2 of the vulnerabilities, and the vulnerability index, which is opposing basically what usually is advocated in the WTO, which is predictability. I let you say a couple of words to that, I think.
Thanks, Fran. Yes, and I think that I would say that the situation for me, I just find it very it's strange for me to speak to a blank screen. I do have to say that it's sort of a very surreal experience, which also speaks to, you know, the difference between pedagogy and the ways in which we can engage with one another, because we really do take for granted here that we can just switch on our Teams and see everyone's faces. And that there's that element of this that I think that something you've just touched on there, Fran, that's really important. You know, I mentioned those apps that exist and the platforms in Ghana, but you're absolutely right. It's just a few countries in Africa that have the capacity and the infrastructure to embed these platforms within their systems. And that in itself creates new leaders and new losers within the system. And so it's finding ways to create more equitable playing fields and leveling that playing field. And hopefully, you know, there will be ways to do that, which we can think about towards the end. But it is a very real concern as to how we can move forward. And I think that the digital inclusion is a really important part of the future story of resolving not only just this crisis, but building resilience and creating better paths to independence and lesser paths to dependency for all countries. So what we know about, as Fran has mentioned, the way in which we identify, should we say, a country's status in the World Trade Organization is actually a process of self-designation. So if I choose to say, for example, that as a country, I'm a developing country, that's what I am. And around vulnerability theory, so some of my work at the moment is engaging with Martha Feynman's theory of vulnerabilities. And she talks about how actually if you have a group, and she's talking more about humans, about communities of individuals. If you have individuals that are classified as a vulnerable group, but then somebody within that group kind of abuses the status almost, it can degrade and erode the power of the rest of the vulnerable group as being classified as vulnerable. Now, what I mean by this, and I'll use an example within the WTO, is that China still self-designates as a developing country. And China's self-designation as a developing country, as you will learn later in our conversation, is a real sticking point for a lot of countries and especially America. Now, using that approach of vulnerabilities, you can see very clearly how China designating as developing can perhaps erode or diminish the significance of another country as being classified as developing, a country that really does need special and differential treatment under the WTO system. And in part, the ways in which we classify countries in the WTO is a huge reason behind the crisis, one of the crises it currently faces as a system. So some institutions, including the European Investment Bank and the Caribbean Development Bank, have started to reframe the ways in which we understand trade and countries and how we model the risks associated, for example, with lending and investment. Now, they've come up with what they're calling the Trade Vulnerability Index, the TVI. Now, there are different models. The work of Jason Cotton and Jean-Yves Remy and Alicia Nichols, who are based in the Caribbean, has been really important for highlighting how a trade vulnerability index could be a useful alternative in the ways in which we understand country status within a system. Now, I'm not going to get into the ins and outs of whether special and deferential treatment is a good thing, whether the system is in need of massive reform, which I think it is, or whether we've had it in place since 1979 and it's done very little to progress a lot of countries into the integration of the system. But what is pivotal about this is the ways in which we identify and classify vulnerabilities. Common to all of the models of the TVIs, those trade vulnerability indices, is the understanding that vulnerabilities are linked to dependencies. And the EIB, so the European Investment Bank, has stated in its most recent report that heavy dependence on a particular type of revenue is a strong driver of COVID-19 vulnerability. And I just want us to reflect on that and think about the number of individual African countries that have a heavy dependency on exports of particular commodities, for example, and how that could be a strong driver of its own COVID-19 vulnerability. Now, factors that they think about when they're looking at the Trade Vulnerability Index, key factors to vulnerability include things relating to the quality of the healthcare system, the structure of the economy and its dependency on, say, for example, tourism, global value chains, remittances, commodity exports, the structure of that economy and its exposure to trade shocks, how trade open it is, what dependence it has and on what strategic imports and exports, the size of the economy. Is it an island nation, for example, that might be more vulnerable, therefore, to certain natural disasters or climate change issues? We're also looking, when we look at a trade vulnerability index, at the critical issue that's often overlooked by particularly trade lawyers in the WTO when we're thinking about framing rules, is governance. What governance framework is in place within that country to ensure that actually the revenue is being used in the way that will create a resilient economy? So the point of the Trade Vulnerability Index is to be able to identify and pinpoint these pressure points within individual countries. And in doing so, that enables a more context-specific analysis of the country to emerge, but it also allows context-specific responses to potential fragilities or vulnerabilities to be addressed. So it's a very different way of conceiving the way in which we look at economies from a trade perspective, at least. I should hasten to add that they've been looking at vulnerabilities in other disciplines for a very long time. So in public health, vulnerabilities analysis is prevalent. In trade, it's non-existent until very, very recently. Even though we do talk obviously about poverty and inequalities within that system, we haven't talked about dependencies and inequalities in the vulnerabilities frame in such an explicit way. So when we talk about vulnerabilities, we're going to move on now, if you're okay with that, Fran, to the crisis pre-COVID.
Yes, I wanted to just quickly ask Firoz, we will do the remaining parts very quickly because we just wanted to highlight something about pre-crisis and then some outlooks. But do you have a specific plan? Should we when we should stop? Because we try to make it now very quick because people we would like to also rather engage.
Yes, well, you know, I'm in your hands really. You've covered a lot of ground already.
Yes.
And so when we get to that point, whoever wants to ask a question and participate in that way,
yes,
you know, can unmute and indicate by raising their hand. So we'll get
okay.
Okay.
I understand. Claire, I do the next part just in a few sentences, and then we rather jump to the outlooks and our suggestions. What do you think?
Perfect.
Yeah. So because we wanted to not miss the point that besides the fact that the crisis, the pandemic or crisis, or no, I don't want to use the word crisis now, the pandemic has contributed a lot to vulnerabilities and not just contributed, also highlighted them, revealed them, and deepened them. The WTO is not in a crisis because of that. And many of you in that forum, because I see that, do know that. The WTO was before in a crisis, and that has nothing to do with the pandemic. So when those stats are shown in terms of economic decline, the economic the growth was before already in goods anyway in decline, -3%, and in services just on the slide up. So it was there before, and that had to do, to summarize that very briefly, with all this shift in geopolitics and the shift in the trade patterns. The shift in the trading patterns, Claire has already highlighted with the global value chains. But just to remind us in terms of geopolitics, what we have experienced right before the pandemic was, and I'm not a fan of US bashing, despite me not liking the current president. However, what happened there was actually leading up to that crisis. And I just need to do the keywords of the trade war with China that lost on both sides billions of of revenue, the escalation of that crisis at the appellate body, which is not operable anymore, the whole shift to the regionalism, which raised the question of multilateralism as still an operable tool for the future. I mentioned that because we wanted to address it quickly. The general rise in anti-globalism, economic nationalism, and the not resolving of the Doha round. And that was important for me to highlight, because the not solving of the Doha round there are key issues for developing countries, and that goes back to agricultural subsidies in its heart, that have to be addressed and that they are not addressed, and which is why negotiations are completely on a hold. And I think that's enough, because there are many trade lawyers in that forum to highlight that this crisis from before, and that's the last point to that, makes it even more difficult now to recover from the COVID pandemic than it was in the crisis that we experienced in 2008 and 9, the financial crisis. Because the WTO was already in a crisis, yeah. So not just because of the pandemic. I hand over to you.
Okay, thanks, Fran.
I think we just go to part 3 now.
Yeah. So what we're interested in, and as Fran says, we know that many of you in the room are experts already. So we are really looking forward to your expert insights into some of these issues. I am perhaps less pessimistic about the future of the World Trade Organization than maybe I should be. And I think that something that's come out from the pandemic is that countries are cooperating in certain ways, in ways that they weren't before. And so I think that we could explore ways in which we move forward to recover from what has been a really devastating social and economic event. So we've already seen signs of success in the WTO in things like the Trade Facilitation Agreement, for example, that's enabled customs clearance to get faster and goods to be exported and moved around more quickly and more expediently. But we need those systems to be resilient systems. It needs to be a global system that fosters equality and fairness among and between states. As Fran mentioned earlier, so I will not labour the point, we have new rules being discussed and addressed at the WTO around digital trade and investment facilitation, around state-owned enterprises. We need to make sure that the trade rules are operable in a way that contributes to achieving sustainable development under the SDGs. But I think one thing that we really need to think about is whether these rules are fit for purpose to respond to future crises, and that might include a future pandemic. Let's hope not, but it could. So we're also seeing rules at the WTO and within free trade agreements that recognise the role of small and medium-sized enterprises within the economy. So there's already been a shift of focus away from just the role of transnational corporations towards these small and medium-sized enterprises rather than the big global ones. And we also need to think about, as scholars within the broader discipline of law and development, how we can better support developing countries through special and differential treatment. That's something that's on the table at the moment. How do we actually think about better ways to bring those countries into a system that is inclusive? So we, as Fran has already touched upon, and I really don't want to labour points here, is that, can we even achieve consensus on some of these issues? We're already seeing increasing protectionist behaviours from lots of different members, but particularly the US. But, we're likely to see increasingly protectionist behaviours, I expect, from the UK and other countries. So how do we build multilateral responses that are based on some broad consensus? We're also looking here at how we can reform dispute settlement. We already know that the multi-party interim agreement, arbitration settlement agreement is in place, but it's amongst a very small group of countries, and we don't know how long that will go on for. Meanwhile, the US has filed its appeal to the appellate body that no longer functions to delay any kind of measure being taken in that case. So there are lots of problems that we need to think about of how we can equip the system to become more resilient. And Fran, I'm sure you've probably got a couple of things to add, so I'll let you jump in.
So I actually don't know what you talked about because I just came back a couple of seconds ago. I had electricity cut.
What's out?
That is fitting to.
Oh, hello. I think she might be gone again. Fran, are you there? I think she's experiencing technical difficulties.
Now
okay,
we hear,
so
now we don't.
no.
Okay.
So I think then,
Can
Firoz,
you
then we'll
take
just
over there? Yeah.
if we just open it up to questions, I suppose, and Fran will probably rejoin us when she can, I'm sure.
Okay. Okay, we can do that. So colleagues, let's open up the discussion at this point. Let's hope that Francisca can join the conversation. What I suggest is that you indicate with the hand function that you have a question or you want to make a comment. Allow me the opportunity to call upon you, and then you unmute. Will that work? So I'm now looking at the hand function. Excuse me, that wasn't an outage. Yeah. So let's jump in. Any takers? Any takers? Hand function?
I think a couple of people on the chat are going to leave and rejoin because there are issues with sound.
I see. So maybe I can jump in then. I found this concept of vulnerability and the vulnerability indexing extremely rich. It's going to help us think about many of the questions I think that our jurisdictions like ours will face. What I'd like to ask perhaps more specifically is, so how do we build resilience and avoid economic nationalism? I mean, when it's framed in that way, there is the implicit suggestion that policies aimed at ensuring some self-sufficiency in certain areas, like healthcare, to deal with a future pandemic, are somehow are protectionist. So what's the boundary between how do you make a principled distinction between protectionism and legitimate concerns with, say, with resilience, with building resilience, having regard to our experience, if you like, over the last 2 decades with the trading system, and in the light perhaps of COVID-19? Is it not legitimate to be thinking about ensuring that the next time round we should not be in a position where we're dependent on others? I mean, there's a sort of collective action problem here, which we've got to think about. If we don't have our own PPP, if we don't, well, okay, so I suppose one could also, the vaccine, there's certainly, when one looks at the impact of COVID-19, there's strong considerations which suggest we need global action, collective action at a global level, cooperation at a global level. But can we depend on the good faith of other countries, especially powerful countries in the global system? So that's more or less.
I mean, I think there's two really interesting points there, Firoz, so thank you very much for those. The first one around building resilience, and this is something that the pandemic has, I think, revealed quite an interesting sort of tension within the system. That ordinarily, if a state or a member was imposing a domestic measure that another member deemed to be deeply offensive, you might well get a dispute going through either bilateral or multilateral track. But what seems to be happening is that there is at the moment a lot of goodwill and good faith being exercised. If countries are exercising export restrictions, it's because they really need to. And so we'll sort of have that generous approach of saying, on a needs basis, you can do this. When does that start to slip into economic nationalism and high levels of protectionism? I think it probably already was before the pandemic had taken hold, and I think that's one of the big issues. Certainly, in the US-China trade war is a real obvious example of that, right? So we're already seeing countries trying to exercise their own economic nationalism the way that they can. How do we build resilience against that? This will take a system, as you say, in basically what I would take to be your second point really is that you need a collective, you need a community-based response, and one that is deemed to be legitimate by the community. And I suppose part of the problem at the moment for the WTO is that not all members see it to be legitimate, and that's why we have this asphyxiation of the appellate body, right? Because the US doesn't see that as a legitimate form of authority. So I think that in building that resilience, what the WTO will need to think about moving forward is ways to bring everyone to the table. And I think that some movement towards that is already happening because we are seeing interinstitutional cooperation quite successfully ongoing. So, there's lots of cooperation between the WTO and the ILO and the WTO and the WHO and the FAO. And so we're seeing lots of interinstitutional cooperation. But I think that so long as we have these disruptors in the system, like the US, who's going to aggravate any forms of change, we're going to have real problems in reaching that community-based response. Where I think there could be forms of resilience built into the system is to strengthen sort of the cooperatives within the WTO. So to strengthen developing country responses through the groups that they're party to. I'm really interested to sort of see how this situation might influence further negotiations on the AFCFTA, for example, to see if Africa will come up with specific kind of ways of dealing with disruptions that are perhaps more specific to African countries. But we also have to bear in mind that each African country is very different to the next in many ways. And that's where I agree with you that the Trade Vulnerability Index will enable those sort of nuances and particularities to come out more neatly, I think, than the current way of doing things. So in short, that was a very long way of going around saying I simply don't know. But that I think that it's something that work needs to be done on.
I'm back.
Oh, hallelujah. There you are.
Francisca?
Sorry. Yes, I'm right here.
Okay, great.
Okay.
We'd started the conversation about, resilience and economic nationalism, protectionism, where to draw the line. So I've got a very interesting engagement with Claire on that. So anyone else want to continue that conversation or start a new line of inquiry? I see, is there, I think Jonathan's raised his hand. Okay, John, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Firoz, and thank you, Fran and Claire, for a presentation that was very clear and detailed and helpful. Thanks. I guess I actually wanted to just continue a little bit on the Trade Vulnerability Index and thinking of the way that, yeah, do you see that as a tool or a concept that comes in at the level of policy and legal instruments, or is it more a kind of understanding of how countries and sectors fit together and therefore would be more useful in terms of civil society participating in negotiations in trade, etc.? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and it's really lovely to hear you again after seeing you last year. My response to this would be that I see it as being able to do both things. So most of the mappings and the framings of the TVI by the relevant teams is actually around using it as a tool, as you say, a practical tool that will guide decision making and negotiations. In the Caribbean group, it's more to do with eligibility for special and differential treatment. And how that could, if we mapped individual countries according to various different factors, how that might identify particular needs and help them to create a more coherent negotiating strategy as we look to reform certain rules. I also think it could be a very important tool and mechanism to enable civil society to support countries in those strategies. And actually, I also think it could be a really important tool for governments to identify within their own jurisdictions where their vulnerabilities are, both internally and externally, so that they might get a better picture of where they need to diversify their economic base, perhaps, where they need to think about diverting resource to public and social expenditure, and how they then fit within that bigger global economy. And I think it would help them to identify where their paths of dependency actually are. So I see it as doing those three things. I'm not sure if Fran would like to add anything.
No, I think you covered it pretty well. What I would maybe highlight is that it also could help in the current debate about the designation of states. So we are it seems kind of stuck at the moment in terms of the demands of the US, EU, and so with regards to who's really developing, and then we have the emerging countries and so on. When we identify that more along vulnerabilities and that index, and actually speaks then more to the actual needs. So in so far, I think it could also be a negotiation tool and then regulatory tool for such questions. But as Claire said, it is also to identify the actual problems and then work into regulation, which is sometimes very difficult when you're on a multilateral forum where everyone wants to be treated kind of the same and has and there's not a different language spoken. I'm not sure that I answered your question or that we answered your question, Jonathan.
Yeah, no, you did. Thank you. That was lovely. And it's very interesting to see the progression of this vulnerability theory into different sectors and sub-disciplines of law. But thanks very much. Yeah.
Any other takers? Okay, let me try again. No one else. So I'm afraid, Claire, but Francesca, I think, already knows this. I'm not a trade specialist, so I might reveal my own vulnerabilities.
That's okay. Go ahead.
I don't know okay. So I suppose the big question in I think that the established trade regime has not provided sufficient flexibility for countries to sufficient policy flexibility to foster development over the last 20 years. The system embodied in the WTO has helped some developing countries, India, China, obviously, and I don't know how the Chinese can get away with making the claim today that they're still a developing country. But we face the challenge of building in a country like South Africa, as part of our continent, of creating a resilient, productive economy. Now, when I look at the world today, suddenly the United States that authored this rule-based system over the last 20 years is no longer working for them. The United States is now having prescribed a certain conception of free trade. With apologies to Francisca, I don't know if this kind of sounds like a certain kind of anti-Americanism, but the United States
Please don't
now,
apologize.
The United States now, it's frankly, at least under Trump, I don't know what Biden will be doing. I hope he wins.
That's how you formulated it now.
Promoting a frankly protectionist agenda.
Okay.
So the question I have in my mind is in the new, if you like, from a realist perspective, taking power into account, not just norms. Looking also at our vulnerabilities with respect to digitalization. And the real possibility that we are once again going to end up as rule takers, unable to utilize the possibilities of digitalization to not only to address issues of resilience, but actually to address the aspirations of the South African people, yes, people across our continent. What, you know, okay, so the Chinese and the United States, they have the wherewithal to conduct a trade war that damages us all. What should we in the southern tip of Africa and across our continent, maybe across our region and our continent, what is the trade agenda that we should be pursuing that will foster development?
Okay, thanks for that question. Let me, before I answer that last question directly, just make a note on something you said before in terms of China and how can they be still a developing country. There was actually a case recently that addressed that question inadvertently, because China argued that they are a market economy. Mm-hmm. In that case, so that went to the panel stage, and we don't have a decision on that for the reason that the draft decision got leaked and China got hold of it. Towards that decision, the US already threatened that if and so on that is decided like this, then we will definitely withdraw, but that's what they threat all the time anyway. So not to take serious, and if it happens, and so it goes. But the interesting thing is that it was leaked, and the report very clearly pointed out very harshly that China is not a market economy in that sense. Which means that China reacted straight away and withdraw from that decision, so that not even the report can be read, so that it cannot be used later against them when they argue that they are a developing country. That is interesting what power actually such a panel decision could have for the later designation of that. Now, to the question that you ask in terms of what can we do that we not just rule takers, and I was chucked out for a while here, that's why I don't know what was said, but I would have also ended and specifically when you look at the digital future now, because I don't think it will change much, even if COVID is a little bit calmed down. People will have be accustomed to digital solutions, and it will play a huge role. So we have to make a plan of how to do it. And multilateral, that will not happen very soon. That will take forever because there's too many disagreements. Specifically, South Africa steps the foot in on multilateral negotiations. So what I can see only as a solution there is the African free trade agreement, which is now enforced, not implemented. They have difficulties now because of this COVID thing. But Vankele Mena, the Secretary General, just recently said that the new digital trade is a new thing for Africa, and I hope that he will do that. And that's why it is so important to identify the vulnerabilities. Because if you now start to regulate on an African continent digital trade rules, in my opinion, you would be very careful and take into account those vulnerabilities. That means regulation in a way that not only addresses the general exchange, what you usually regulate in trade, but also take into account the digital divide and actually address that with the rules. Maybe take into account that rules that are no-go on international level, like data localization, and who owns the data. On international level, you can even start to discuss that, but you can do that on African level, and you can, and you might have to even, because the big techs control already that market. So that why, and good that Jonathan is also here, competition rules need to be anyway considered to control monopolies, which you cannot prevent that they are there already. So I think that's also a point, Claire, and I wanted to make, that you have to understand completely the field with the vulnerabilities in it, in a specific sector and for a specific region, to be able to make wise decisions of how to regulate it in a way that it works for the continent and for you, and that maybe that's then not exactly rule takers. Which brings me to one last point, sorry Claire, is that then maybe you can take these rules from the African level, because there's nothing on multilateral level yet there, and offer it as an alternative solution. And it's not just because at the moment you have rules from Asia, Australia has a book there, US, so they have already rules, but then you can also offer alternatives with an alternative approach to a specific problem. That would be, for me.
Yeah, and I think, Fran, I don't really have much else to add to that, because I can see that another hand has been raised, so I don't want to sort of take too much time. But you know, your final point, and digital and data is not my area of expertise, so I might sound like a fool myself when I say this, but my understanding is that, and I'm sure Fran can comment more if needs be, is that we don't even properly at the moment have a conversation at the multilateral level about how we define data. And so what will be included within these agreements is still actually up for grabs, but that there are different approaches, be it from the EU or China or the US, that tend to be the dominant approaches at the moment. And so, as Fran says, if African countries can sort of create a coherent response to these sorts of challenges that work in their interests, then, you know, that would be a really good way forward, I think. And I think Fran's probably captured everything else I would want to say in response to your question.
Great, Claire. Lucy, I hope I don't. My Xhosa is not very good. I hope I got my pronunciation correct. Please go ahead.
It was half decent, Prof. It's okay. My question.
That's a pass mark.
Just above 51. Okay. What opportunities, because I understand the vulnerabilities that both Claire and Fran have really delved into, but what opportunities are there because of these vulnerabilities? Because I'd like to think that because we are this vulnerable, possibly we could come out of this better in some ways. So where are places where we can improve and sort of really strike on the opportunities presented by the vulnerabilities of COVID?
Sure. So I think that that's a really lovely question, and I think that I'm an interdisciplinary lawyer. So I'm a lawyer who likes to draw on interdisciplinary insights from other disciplines. I also tend to work as part of interdisciplinary teams. And I think that for me, to develop resilient responses to vulnerabilities requires interdisciplinarity. And I think that when we're thinking about forging responses, we need to draw in experts in public health, experts in social issues, human rights, gender, development issues, and bring those into the room with economists and with lawyers and policymakers to identify where issues interlink. Now, there are certain initiatives with, across the African continent that have shown how you can overcome some of the challenges presented by trade. So, for example, you have the non-tariff barrier reporting, monitoring and evaluation mechanism that was established under the tripartite free trade agreement, but is now being scaled up under AFCFTA. And that enables traders to be able to use a notification system using a digital platform to identify where they have experienced a technical barrier to trade, and the response from the relevant authority to that technical barrier is then made public, and it shows if it's being resolved or monitored and how that evaluation process is going. And I think that what we will need is lots more of those small scale initiatives to start off with that enable us to show the response immediately. I mean, in the UK, for example, we have a system here at the moment in response to the pandemic called Track and Trace. And if you ever look at the UK news, you'll see how woefully inadequate our response to the pandemic has been as a so-called developed country. And already we're seeing that our system is not resilient. We try to, you're meant to put down your name somewhere and then they can trace you using your mobile phone. If you have been found to come into contact with someone who's got COVID, they can let everyone else who is in that place know that you were positive. Now, that's a good idea in theory, but it goes back to Fran's point earlier on that you have to have the infrastructure in place to do these things. I think what the examples that I've come across on the African continent that work well are where there has been cooperation between regional economic communities and they're pooling their resources. So they can actually say, okay, well, looking at these trans or cross-border issues, how can we form responses? But Fran, I'm sure you've probably got more to add here in terms of how they can move forward.
I think I fully agree with you, and MX, that's how I call him, Firoz, it's easier, knows that I work a lot in linkage issues. So do you, Claire? So I think that goes to the core of it, that for specifically those trade linkages, where you kind of like always ask the question about an intersection between a trade issue and then, let's say, a social economic issue, like public health, or let's say the environment, or labor law standards. So you ask those questions, but it was always stuck in a discussion in WTO law with Article 20, right? The discussion was, okay, to what extent can I consider it in an interpretation in a court case? But this is it. I think in a taxation case, Brazil taxation, from the appellate body, was it even, they actually considered the digital inclusion as an aim that could be justifiable via Article 20. But yeah. Is that enough? Is that enough? So that's the question. So if you have that vulnerability index and those information, you can work it in more into the discussion and into what I think will be for a reform anyway necessary. For the reform, you will have now those who argue the whole time it can only be about trade and we have to go back to the core issues. And if you don't do that, the WTO will be lost and all of that. So you have those. And then you have those, and Peter van den Bosch is also on that other side saying you have to take the societal issues into account when you really want it to be successful. And I think the EU as such, even if it's smaller, is a good example. It also just started as an economic union. And over time, it was clear that it can't be like this. it can't stop there if it should work. I mean, Claire, and Brexit is now a bad example, but I mean, the island was anyway never a part of Europe. But
oh, Fran, how very dare you?
No, but I mean, I hope that I came a bit closer to what you were asking, MX.
I was going to say, I see your hand is still up.
Oh, apologies, I should have taken down. I completely, no, thank you for answering that. That was very good. Thank you.
Any more takers? I don't see any questions. Well, so let's round up perhaps then. What I'd like to say is this. I hope that this seminar is not a once-off. I think it's going to be very important in the time ahead to combine, to leverage, to source all the expertise that we have at Wits University, in the country, so other universities, and across the globe, people like Claire, to assist us to address some of these questions, particularly around, I think, the opportunities. It's the one potential framework, I think, for this country and our continent to address, to deal with the vulnerabilities that we face, but also to start to address in a serious way the challenges that we are going to face in the coming period. And I think they're going to be very serious. So we want to promote trade on the continent. We want to promote trade and development. And I think our role potentially is to, on the basis of solid research, interdisciplinary research, to contribute meaningfully to the policy debate, but also constructively to the decision-making process. Because one of our vulnerabilities is certainly that that's lacking. I think the sort of nexus between expertise on the one hand and decision-making. So we can help bridge that gap, make a meaningful contribution to trade and development of our continent, while addressing our kind of external vulnerabilities. We'll be making an important contribution. So I hope that the Mandela Institute, with people like Fran and Simo, who's in France at the moment, other colleagues in the law school, other colleagues in other universities and so forth, and across the globe, in the United Kingdom, Bristol University, can coalesce around a project that is meaningful. Thank you very much to all participants. Thank you especially to Claire and Francesca for very serious presentations with meaningful content. And as I say, I hope that it's the beginning of other webinars, research, and conversations about trade and development. Thank you very much all, and good night.
Thank you, Firoz, and thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for being such a captive audience. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank you. It was only a pleasure.
Good night.